My sister publicly threw me out of the house, convinced she had all the power and that no one would stand up for me. As she celebrated her victory in front of the entire family, Grandpa quietly stepped forward. What he revealed next shattered her confidence, exposed the truth, and changed everything in a single moment. I am Nia, 35 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful real estate developer, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward, smirking. You know, Nia, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way. I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut, meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue at my mother Elaine's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's, joined honor societies, and did absolutely everything possible to earn the respect of parents who only had eyes for my older sister Chloe. But all of that deeply painful history finally culminated last weekend during what was supposed to be a traditional Sunday dinner at Grandpa Elijah's historic Atlanta estate. The Sunday dinner was not merely a casual family gathering. It was a highly calculated, meticulously orchestrated political performance. My brother-in-law DeAndre was running a highly contested campaign for the state Senate. He and Chloe had completely transformed Grandpa Elijah's beautiful historic living room into a sterile networking hub for high-net-worth political donors, local mega-church pastors, and influential community leaders. The air inside the grand house was thick with the smell of expensive cologne, the aroma of roasted meats, and the suffocating weight of respectability politics. Our parents, Calvin and Yvonne, were busy working the room. They were practically glowing with pride as they introduced DeAndre to potential campaign financiers, shaking hands and offering wide, perfectly practiced smiles. They treated Chloe like the absolute queen of the evening. She was draped in designer silk, wearing diamonds that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. Meanwhile, I was treated exactly like the hired help. I had intentionally arrived early to check on Grandpa Elijah. He sat parked in his wheelchair in a dark, quiet corner near the grand staircase, completely ignored by the swirling crowd of elites. At 78 years old, the man who had built a massive, highly lucrative commercial logistics and real estate empire from the ground up during the 1970s was now putting on a brilliant performance of his own. He feigned severe dementia. He let his head droop down to his chest and allowed his eyes to stare blankly ahead at the wall. My family assumed he was completely oblivious to his surroundings. They talked over him, ignored his needs, and occasionally used him as a convenient prop to demonstrate their supposedly strong family values to the visiting political donors. But I knew the absolute truth. Behind that vacant, cloudy stare, Grandpa Elijah possessed a mind as sharp as a steel trap. I was silently observing every single greedy, manipulative move his children and grandchildren made in his house. I was quietly arranging a silver tray of intricate, expensive appetizers, deliberately trying to stay out of the way of the wealthy guests, when Chloe spotted me from across the room. She held a glass of expensive champagne in one hand and had a wealthy real estate investor clinging to her other arm. I could immediately see the malicious, familiar glint in her eyes. She hastily excused herself from the donor and marched directly toward me, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. As I turned around to place the heavy tray on the buffet table, Chloe deliberately shoved her shoulder hard against mine. The impact was violent and entirely intentional. The heavy silver tray slipped from my grasp, crashing to the floor with a deafening metallic clatter. Gourmet appetizers scattered everywhere across the expensive Persian rug. The lively, buzzing conversations in the living room ground to an immediate dead halt. Every single head in the room turned to look at the massive mess on the floor, and then they all stared directly at me. "Take your dirty hands back to whatever construction site you crawled out of," Chloe announced. Her voice was sharp, cruel, and intentionally loud enough to carry across the completely silent room. "DeAndre is hosting state senators today. This is an elite gathering, not a charity shelter for broke college dropouts looking for a handout. Get out of the way." A collective gasp rippled through the well-dressed crowd. My mother Yvonne rushed over immediately, her face flushed with deep embarrassment. She did not kneel to help me clean up the spilled food. She did not ask if I was hurt. Instead, she glared at me with absolute unfiltered contempt. "Chloe is exactly right," my mother hissed, pointing a manicured finger sharply toward the front door. "You are 35 years old, completely unmarried, and spending your days covered in cheap dust at ruined building sites. Get out of the way and let your sister do her important job. You are embarrassing us in front of the pastor and DeAndre's biggest sponsors. Leave the room immediately." I looked over at my father, Calvin, who stood nearby holding a heavy glass of scotch. He simply turned his back on me, smoothly engaging a donor in conversation as if I did not even exist. For 35 long years I had swallowed my pride just to keep the peace in this family. When I abandoned a traditional corporate law degree to pursue real estate development and historic preservation, they had permanently labeled me a severe failure. They genuinely thought I was destitute, struggling to flip rundown houses in forgotten, dangerous neighborhoods. They had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last decade tirelessly building Vanguard Heritage Holdings into a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not scramble to pick up the ruined food from the floor. I simply wiped my hands on a linen napkin, stood up incredibly straight, and looked my arrogant sister directly in the eyes. I slowly reached into my designer handbag, a bag which Chloe had previously mocked as a cheap knockoff, and pulled out a sleek, solid black corporate credit card. I tossed it lightly onto the pristine mahogany dining table, where it landed with a soft, authoritative thud. "I am not serving you, Chloe," I said. My voice was calm, perfectly measured, and completely devoid of intimidation. "I am inspecting my staff." Chloe frowned deeply, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together in genuine confusion. "What are you babbling about?" she demanded, crossing her arms defensively. "The elite catering company you hired for tonight, the one charging you $300 a plate to impress these local politicians, is completely owned by Vanguard Heritage Holdings." I explained clearly, making absolutely sure the wealthy donors standing nearby could hear every single word. "I am the founder and CEO of Vanguard. Those professional chefs working in the kitchen right now work directly for me. And since you want to loudly discuss handouts in front of your distinguished guests, I think it is only fair to mention that your catering invoice is currently 30 days past due. If you do not settle the $15,000 balance by tomorrow morning, my legal team will immediately send it to collections." The silence in the grand room was absolute. The wealthy investors exchanged shocked, uncomfortable glances. DeAndre, who had been enthusiastically working the room near the grand fireplace, suddenly stopped talking, his face rapidly draining of all color. My mother looked as though she had just been slapped across the face. "You are lying!" Chloe spat viciously, though her hands were visibly trembling, holding her champagne glass. "You are a dropout. You do not own a corporate holding group. You are just incredibly jealous of DeAndre's political success, and you are deliberately trying to ruin his major campaign event." "You can easily verify the ownership records online," I replied smoothly, completely unbothered by her rising panic. "But I highly suggest you focus your energy on finding the funds to pay your outstanding bills, instead of publicly insulting the people who are feeding your guests." The profound humiliation radiating from Chloe was almost palpable. Her carefully constructed, highly manicured image as the wealthy elite political wife was crumbling right in front of her most important social circle. Driven by pure spite and the desperate, frantic need to regain control of the room, she reached into her expensive designer tote bag and pulled out a thick, official-looking legal document. She slammed it down hard on the table right next to my black card. "You think you are so smart," Chloe sneered, her voice shaking with unhinged rage. "You think owning a little catering company gives you power in this family? Look at this document, Nia. Read it and weep." I glanced down at the paper resting on the mahogany table. It was a formal power of attorney form, legally transferring full control of Grandpa Elijah's medical and financial decisions directly to Chloe. I immediately noticed that the signature at the bottom looked incredibly shaky, uneven, and entirely wrong. "I am the legal power of attorney for Grandpa now," Chloe announced triumphantly, raising her voice to ensure the entire room heard her perceived victory. "The old man's mind is completely gone, and Dad agreed that I am the absolute best person to manage the estate. From tomorrow morning, DeAndre and I are taking over this entire property to use as his official campaign headquarters." My parents stood silently behind her, silently validating the horrific theft of my grandfather's lifelong legacy. They were completely willing to strip the man who built their generational wealth of his agency, just to fund DeAndre's political ambitions and secure their own social status. "Since I legally control the property now," Chloe continued, a cruel, satisfied smile spreading across her face, "you have exactly 1 hour to pack your trash and vacate the guest house out back. You are evicted, Nia. I want you off my property before the dessert course is served." The sheer staggering audacity of her statement hung heavily in the air. She thought she had just delivered a fatal, crushing blow. She genuinely believed she had stripped me of my home, my basic dignity, and my entire connection to the family. She expected me to beg, to cry, or to lose my temper and prove her false narrative that I was an unstable emotional failure. Instead, I casually picked up my black corporate card, slipped it back into my handbag, and smiled warmly. "I will gladly pack my things, Chloe," I said softly, leaning in just slightly. "I just hope you and DeAndre have enough campaign funds remaining to cover the property taxes on this massive estate. They are quite steep this time of year." I turned my back on my furious sister, my stunned parents, and their crowd of shocked guests. I walked slowly and deliberately across the grand living room, my heels echoing rhythmically in the quiet, tense space. As I approached the grand staircase, I passed Grandpa Elijah. He was still slumped heavily in his wheelchair, his chin resting on his chest, playing the part of the tragic, oblivious elder with absolute perfection. But as I brushed closely past him, I felt a sudden, surprisingly strong grip on my wrist. I stopped immediately, cleverly shielding his subtle movement from the rest of the room with my body. Grandpa Elijah slowly opened his eyes. The cloudy, confused gaze he had expertly maintained all evening completely vanished, replaced by a sharp, piercing clarity that sent a thrilling jolt of adrenaline straight through my veins. He reached out with his other hand and pressed a small, cold object firmly into my palm. I closed my fingers around it instantly, immediately recognizing the distinct shape of a metal USB flash drive. "Burn them down, baby girl," he whispered. His voice was incredibly steady, deep, and completely lucid. "Burn them all down to the ground." I immediately let go of my wrist, closed his eyes once more, and let his head drop back down to his chest, seamlessly resuming his performance without missing a single beat. I clutched the USB drive tightly in my hand, feeling the cold metal pressing against my skin. I did not look back at my family as I confidently walked out the front doors of the grand estate and stepped into the cool evening air. They thought they had finally won. They thought they had successfully discarded the black sheep of the family and secured their path to power and immense prestige. But they had absolutely no idea that they had just handed me the match, and Grandpa Elijah had just given me the gasoline. The eviction was not an ending. It was merely the beginning of a meticulous, devastating dismantling of everything they held dear. The heavy oak door of the guest house slammed shut behind me. I stood in the center of the modest living room, dropping my designer handbag onto the kitchen island. For 35 years, I had allowed these people to dictate my worth. Tonight, that chapter officially closed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small metal USB drive Grandpa Elijah had pressed into my palm. Its silver casing felt cold against my skin. I securely tucked it into the hidden zippered compartment of my leather travel duffel. I needed to move fast. I walked into the bedroom and began pulling my tailored blazers and silk trousers from the closet. I folded them with absolute precision, refusing to let the chaos of the main house dictate my movements. My parents thought I lived in this small guest house because I was a broke failure. In reality, I lived here to keep a close eye on Grandpa Elijah and to quietly protect the historic estate from falling into complete disrepair under my parents' negligent, greedy watch. Before I could grab my toiletry bag from the bathroom, the front door violently burst open. The hinges groaned as the heavy wood struck the wall. My mother Yvonne marched into the living space, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure outrage. My father Calvin followed closely behind her, his jaw tightly clenched, his expensive designer suit looking suddenly very restrictive on his rigid frame. They did not come to comfort their daughter after she was publicly humiliated and unlawfully evicted. They came to do what they always did: damage control. "What is fundamentally wrong with you?" Nia Yvonne demanded, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceiling. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at me as I calmly emerged from the bedroom, holding a stack of neatly folded clothes. I placed my clothes into the duffel bag without breaking eye contact. "I am packing, Mother, just as the new legal head of the family requested." "Do not play smart with me," Yvonne snapped, stepping closer, the strong scent of her designer perfume filling the small room and making the air feel thick and suffocating. "You deliberately embarrassed your sister in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta. Your sister is going to be a senator's wife. She is building a real, respectable legacy that elevates this entire family and puts us in the rooms we belong in. And what do? You throw a childish temper tantrum over some catering appetizers. You have been a massive disappointment since you threw away your prestigious law degree to play with bricks and dirt. Stop being so incredibly jealous of Chloe and leave this property quietly before you do any more permanent damage to DeAndre's campaign." I slowly zipped the first compartment of my duffel bag. The absolute delusion was staggering. Yvonne genuinely believed that wearing a hard hat and managing a commercial development firm was somehow beneath the dignity of our family name. She preferred Chloe, a woman whose entire existence was funded by credit cards, predatory loans, and superficial country club networking. "Jealous," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue. "You think I am jealous of a woman who has to forge our grandfather's signature just to pay for her caterers? You think I envy a life built entirely on debt and desperately seeking the approval of strangers?" Calvin stepped forward, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of patriarchal authority. "Do not speak about your sister that way. Chloe has secured the legal right to manage this estate because Elijah is no longer mentally fit. We all agreed to this transition of power. It is what is best for the family assets. You are the only one causing friction because you refuse to accept your place in this family." "My place," I said, leaning casually against the doorframe of the bedroom. "And what place is that, Dad?" "The quiet scapegoat. The invisible failure. You can parade around to make Chloe look better, by comparison. The one you expect to sit silently in the background while you steal everything your own father spent 50 years building. I know exactly what is happening here, and it has absolutely nothing to do with Grandpa Elijah's mental fitness." I walked toward the kitchen island, forcing Calvin and Yvonne to turn and face me. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The raw facts were lethal enough on their own. "You are kicking me out, so DeAndre can use this historic estate as campaign collateral, aren't you?" I stated, watching Calvin's eyes widen slightly in sudden realization. Political campaigns are expensive, and DeAndre is burning through cash faster than he can collect donations. His poll numbers are dropping, and his advertising budget is completely empty. Chloe needs the main house empty, so she can bring in the bank appraisers next week, without me asking uncomfortable questions. Yvonne scoffed, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "That is none of your business. Chloe and DeAndre have a brilliant financial strategy. They are utilizing family assets to guarantee a victory that benefits all of us." "A financial strategy," I said, letting a sharp, mocking laugh escape my lips. I turned my attention directly to my father. "Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Did you tell your golden child Chloe about the massive festering financial secret attached to this property? Did you tell her about the $500,000 tax lien you secretly put on this estate 5 years ago to pay off your absolutely disastrous stock market bets?" The color drained from Calvin's face with the speed of a falling guillotine. He physically staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly, as he struggled to process how I could possibly know about his greatest failure. Yvonne turned to him, her brow furrowed in sudden sharp confusion. "Calvin, what is she talking about? What tax lien? We do not have any liens on this estate." I did not give him a chance to formulate a lie. I kept the pressure completely focused and unrelenting. 5 years ago, I continued taking a step toward them. Dad lost $500,000 trading high-risk tech stocks on margin. He was desperate. He used his temporary access to Grandpa's accounts to take out a quiet, heavily penalized lien against this very property to cover his massive losses before the brokers sued him. He never paid it back. The interest has been compounding for 60 months. Any bank appraiser who looks at the deed to this estate is going to immediately flag a massive, undeniable debt. DeAndre cannot use this house for collateral. The property is financially radioactive. Calvin swallowed hard beads of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. Nia, shut your mouth right now. You do not understand the complex realities of corporate finance. I understand that you committed financial fraud against your own father, I replied coldly. And I understand that Chloe's grand plan to mortgage this house is going to blow up in her face the second the bank runs a title search. Before Calvin could stammer out another pathetic excuse, the front door swung open again. Chloe burst into the room. She held the forged power of attorney document tightly in her fist, waving it around like a royal scepter. Her face was flushed with the thrill of unearned power. I do not care about his debts, Chloe shouted, entirely dismissing the revelation of our father's $500,000 financial crime as if it were a minor inconvenience. She marched right past our stunned parents and shoved the legal document directly into my face. You are just trying to stall Nia. You are trying to make up ridiculous lies about tax liens to scare me into letting you stay. Well, it is not going to work. I control the assets now. Every single brick, every single bank account, and every single plot of land Grandpa owns belongs to me. I am selling Grandpa's commercial lots downtown tomorrow morning to cover DeAndre's campaign shortfall. I already have a buyer lined up. We are going to liquidate those dusty, useless lots for pure cash, and there is absolutely nothing you or your imaginary tax liens can do to stop me. I looked at the piece of paper trembling in her hand. I looked at my mother, who was now staring at my father with rising, terrified suspicion. I looked at my father, who was practically hyperventilating at the thought of his secret debt coming to light during Chloe's impending real estate sale. She had no idea that selling them under a forged power of attorney constituted massive federal wire fraud. I simply smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smirk that finally caused a brief, fleeting shadow of doubt to cross Chloe's triumphant face. I reached over, grabbed my bag, and walked straight out. The heavy gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked away from the estate. I did not look back. I knew my father was hyperventilating, desperately trying to hide his massive tax lien from Chloe. My mother was likely interrogating him, her world of perfect respectability completely shattering. Meanwhile, Chloe was staring at that forged power of attorney, completely oblivious to the federal crimes she was about to commit. Exactly 1 week later, I stood in the gilded lobby of Greater Grace Fellowship. This was the most exclusive megachurch in Atlanta, where faith was strictly measured by the designer label on your Sunday suit. I certainly was not there to pray. I was there to meet a specialized stone contractor regarding a historic commercial facade Vanguard Heritage Holdings had quietly acquired the previous month. I stood near the massive stained glass windows, reviewing blueprints on my tablet, waiting for the contractor to arrive. The heavy oak doors to the main sanctuary were propped wide open, allowing the booming, theatrical voice of the guest speaker to echo straight into the lobby. I recognized that slick, overly rehearsed cadence immediately. It was DeAndre. I stepped closer to the sanctuary entrance, slipping unnoticed into the back row of the velvet-lined pews. The congregation was massive, over 3,000 people staring raptly at the stage. DeAndre stood behind the crystal podium, gripping the edges tightly, projecting the image of a deeply burdened, humble public servant. He was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most of the congregation made in a month. My wife and I have faced unimaginable heartbreak this week. DeAndre projected, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. As you know, our beloved patriarch Elijah has suffered a rapid decline in his mental faculties. The burden of his dementia has fallen heavily on our shoulders. A sympathetic murmur washed over the thousands of attendees. I watched my mother and father in the front row, nodding solemnly and dabbing at dry eyes. Chloe sat beside them, clutching a lace handkerchief, playing the exhausted, devoted granddaughter to absolute perfection. DeAndre paused, letting the heavy silence amplify his political performance. We have had to make agonizing decisions to protect his legacy. He continued, pressing a hand over his heart. But family is our anchor. Family is the foundation of my campaign for the state senate. We must protect our elders, just as we must protect our community. I am running for office because I believe in the sacred duty of preservation, even when it requires making the hardest sacrifices. The congregation erupted into thundering applause. Several people stood up to cheer. It was a masterclass in manipulation. DeAndre was actively using my grandfather's faked illness to secure campaign donations and votes from a community that blindly trusted the illusion of his perfect marriage. He was painting himself as the selfless caretaker while actively plotting to shove the man into a cheap state facility the moment he drained his bank accounts. I felt a cold knot of absolute disgust tighten in my stomach. They were all entirely shameless. As the applause died down, the senior pastor of Greater Grace stepped up to the podium, placing a supportive, heavy hand on DeAndre's shoulder. The pastor was a man who practically lived at my parents' country club, entirely funded by their generous weekly donations. "We thank you, Brother DeAndre, for your unwavering leadership," the pastor bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "But as we pray for healing for Elijah, we must also pray for the fractured elements of this noble family." I felt the atmosphere in the massive room shift instantly. The pastor bowed his head tightly, closing his eyes, and raised his hands toward the ceiling. "We ask for divine intervention for a wayward and rebellious soul," he loudly proclaimed. "We pray for a daughter who has lost her path, who has turned her back on her devoted parents, and who brings strife into a home offering only love. We pray she seeks forgiveness from the family she deeply disrespected." My mother had clearly done her work. She had spent the entire week spinning a vicious, completely fabricated narrative to the church leadership, painting me as an unhinged, jealous outcast who was actively trying to destroy DeAndre's noble campaign. The public shaming was a classic tactic of respectability politics, designed to completely isolate me and destroy any credibility I might have in the community. Several heads in the pews ahead of me turned around. Whispers swept through the aisles as family friends, people who had known me since childhood, located me standing in the back row. Women in wide-brimmed hats glared at me with blatant disapproval. Men in tailored suits shook their heads in performative pity. I was being actively shunned by my own community. They expected me to shrink, to run away in tears, or to hang my head in profound shame. Instead, I stood my ground. I locked eyes with the pastor from across the vast, echoing sanctuary, keeping my posture impeccably straight and my expression completely unbothered by his cowardly theatrical attacks. I did not blink, and I certainly did not bow my head in submission to their transparent fraud. When the service finally concluded, the massive doors swung wide open, and the congregation began flooding into the lavish lobby. People intentionally gave me a wide berth, whispering behind their hands and pulling their children closer as they walked past. I ignored them all, keeping my eyes fixed on the entrance to the VIP pastoral suite. 10 minutes later, DeAndre emerged, adjusting his expensive silk tie and smiling smugly. He was alone, likely heading to the private donor reception in the fellowship hall. I smoothly intercepted him, stepping directly into his path and effectively blocking the narrow hallway. His practiced political smile instantly vanished, replaced by a very deep, ugly sneer. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here," DeAndre muttered, stepping close in a pathetic attempt to physically intimidate me. "Did you enjoy the sermon? Your mother made sure the pastor knew exactly what a toxic liability you are. You are entirely excommunicated from this community." I looked at him with absolute boredom, completely unaffected by his posturing. "I am not interested in your theatrical sermons, DeAndre. I am here for a business meeting. You should try focusing on your own business before your entire campaign implodes." DeAndre laughed, a very harsh, arrogant sound. "You have no business. You are a bitter, evicted dropout. And just so you know, your parents officially went to their lawyers on Friday. They completely cut you out of the family will. You are getting absolutely nothing. Not a single dime, not a single property. You have been entirely erased. He leaned in closer, his voice dripping with venom. Chloe controls Elijah's assets, and your parents control the rest. You are a nobody, Nia. You have no power, no money, and no family. Get out of my way before I have church security throw you out. I did not move a single inch. I tilted my head, examining the arrogant, sweating man standing in front of me. Be very careful, DeAndre, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch that forced him to stop and listen. A politician running on a strict family values platform should not be funneling undocumented campaign donations into offshore gambling accounts in the Bahamas. DeAndre's arrogant smile instantly evaporated. His jaw slackened and the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. The sudden absolute panic in his eyes was glorious to witness. What are you talking about? He stammered, his voice suddenly weak and completely devoid of its previous bluster. You do not know anything at all. You are just making up desperate lies. I stepped closer, entirely invading his personal space. I know that you owe $300,000 to a very unpleasant syndicate in Nassau, I whispered coldly. I know you took a highly illegal bridge loan yesterday to cover those massive losses. And I know you forged my father's signature as a guarantor because Chloe did not have the authority to mortgage the estate. You are drowning, DeAndre, and you are taking my very foolish parents down with you. Before he could formulate a single defensive word, my cell phone vibrated sharply in my hand. I held his terrified gaze and answered the call. It was my lead corporate attorney. Nia, my attorney stated, her voice crisp and urgent over the secure line. Your sister Chloe just listed Elijah's downtown commercial lots for sale on the private market. She bypassed the standard waiting periods, trying to liquidate everything fast for pure cash. I kept my eyes locked directly on DeAndre's sweating, horrified face. I smiled, a slow, predatory expression that promised absolute financial devastation. Let her, I replied coldly into the phone. Make the purchase. I want the deed fully secured by noon. I ended the call with my lead attorney and stepped out of the suffocating, hypocritical atmosphere of the church lobby. Leaving DeAndre pale and trembling in my wake felt deeply satisfying, but the real work was just beginning. Within 20 minutes, my private driver pulled up to the sleek, ultra-modern high-rise in downtown Atlanta that housed Vanguard Heritage Holdings. As I walked through the towering glass doors and rode the private elevator up to the penthouse executive suite, I allowed myself a momentary reflection on the absolute absurdity of my family's delusions. They genuinely believed I spent my days covered in dust begging for scraps at rundown construction sites. In reality, I was the founder and chief executive officer of one of the most aggressive and successful commercial real estate firms in the Southeast. Vanguard occupied the entire top floor, a sprawling expanse of floor-to-ceiling windows, polished concrete and brushed steel. My team of 50 brilliant attorneys, architects, and financial analysts operated like a finely tuned machine, acquiring and preserving historic commercial districts that people like DeAndre and Chloe wanted to bulldoze for cheap political points. I walked past the bustling bullpen of analysts and entered my private corner office. The panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline served as a constant reminder of exactly what I had built while my family was busy tearing me down. I had barely taken my seat behind my massive marble desk when my lead acquisitions attorney Marcus walked in, holding a sleek digital tablet. We have Chloe's real estate broker on the line, Marcus said, tapping the screen. He is completely unaware of our connection to you. He thinks Vanguard is just another faceless corporate holding group with deep pockets. He is pushing aggressively for a same-day, cash closing on Grandpa Elijah's commercial lots. I gestured for Marcus to put the call on the office speakerphone. I gestured for Marcus. The broker sounded frantic, speaking with the rapid, breathless cadence of a man who was promised a massive commission for an impossible turnaround time. My client is highly motivated, the broker insisted, his voice echoing through my pristine office. These are prime downtown lots. She is asking for $3 million, but she is willing to entertain a slightly lower offer if your firm can bypass the standard 30-day due diligence window and wire the funds by this afternoon. I muted the microphone and looked at Marcus. $3 million is already a severe undervaluation of those properties, I said softly. She is practically giving away Grandpa Elijah's legacy just to cover DeAndre's political and gambling debts. It is pathetic. Marcus nodded in agreement. How do you want to play this, Zuri? Unmute the line, I instructed. Marcus tapped the screen. Tell your client that Vanguard Heritage Holdings does not rush due diligence for anyone, Marcus stated firmly, following my silent cues. Furthermore, $3 million is entirely out of the question for a rushed, unverified cash deal. We will offer exactly $800,000. Take it or leave it now. The broker actually gasped audibly and sharply through the speaker. 800,000. That is practically daylight robbery. The land alone is easily worth 4 times that amount. My client will never accept such an insulting fraction of the value. I signaled to Marcus to cut him off. Then we withdraw our interest completely, Marcus said coldly. Have a very good day. Wait, the broker shouted desperately before Marcus could terminate the call. Give me exactly 5 minutes to speak with my client. Do not withdraw the offer. I smiled a cold, calculating smile. Chloe was completely cornered. She needed massive amounts of cash instantly to save her husband's collapsing campaign and pay off the illegal bridge loan they had taken out against Grandpa Elijah's estate. Exactly 4 minutes later, the broker returned to the line, his voice heavy with defeat. My client accepts the $800,000. She said to draw up the contracts immediately. I ended the call and let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Chloe was so blinded by her own greed and desperation that she had just sold millions of dollars in generational wealth for absolute pennies. But the true trap had yet to be sprung. Send the purchase agreement to escrow, I told Marcus. But before we authorize the wire transfer, I need to personally review every single document Chloe submitted to the title company to justify her legal right to sell. 10 minutes later, Marcus placed a thick physical file folder on my desk. Inside were the copies of the escrow documents, including the power of attorney Chloe had flaunted in my face at the guest house. I did not need a forensic expert to see what was glaringly obvious. The signature at the bottom of the power of attorney was a blatant, sloppy forgery. I stared at the looping, jagged letters that were supposed to spell Grandpa Elijah's name. The pressure marks were entirely uneven, indicating someone tracing slowly over an existing image rather than signing with natural fluid motion. The slant of the letters leaned heavily to the left, whereas my grandfather's signature always stood perfectly upright. Chloe had not even bothered to hire a professional. She had likely traced it against a window or used a cheap software program to replicate a signature from an old birthday card. It was an insultingly lazy attempt at a major financial crime. I immediately summoned my entire senior legal team into my office. We are not just buying a property today, I announced to the room of sharp, attentive lawyers. We are building a federal case. I directed my team to begin compiling a massive ironclad binder of evidence. We pulled the metadata from the electronic submission, proving the document was created on a computer registered to DeAndre's campaign headquarters. We cross-referenced the forged signature against decades of Grandpa Elijah's authenticated legal filings. We drafted formal affidavits outlining the timeline of Chloe's desperate attempt to liquidate the assets. This was no longer a simple family dispute over a house. Chloe was committing federal wire fraud by using electronic communications to facilitate a criminal transaction. She was committing grand larceny by selling highly valuable assets she did not legally own. Every single document my team added to the growing black binder tightened the invisible noose around my sister's neck. But sitting in my quiet, controlled office, meticulously structuring their total legal and financial ruin, I had never felt more calm or more powerful. I watched the clock on my wall tick toward noon. The escrow company sent the final confirmation. Chloe had signed the closing papers. The fraudulent transaction was officially complete, leaving a permanent, undeniable paper trail leading directly to her. The trap had officially and permanently slammed shut. The profound silence of my office was suddenly shattered by the sharp ringing of my private cell phone. I glanced at the screen and saw my mother's name flashing brightly. Yvonne rarely called my private number, unless she needed a scapegoat to blame for one of Chloe's inevitable disasters. I picked up the phone, letting the silence stretch for a moment before I spoke. Hello, Mother. Zuri, you need to listen to me very carefully. Yvonne demanded, her voice shrill and vibrating with an ugly, frantic energy. DeAndre's campaign is dangerously short on cash right now. The property sale Chloe arranged is inexplicably delayed in escrow, and they need immediate liquid funds to pay the event staff for the massive gala tonight. The caterers are threatening to walk out. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair looking out over the Atlanta skyline. And why exactly are you calling me about this? I know you have a few $1,000s saved up from your little construction jobs. Yvonne sneered, her tone dripping with the usual condescension and disgust. You live rent-free in our guest house, so you have no real expenses. I demand that you transfer every single cent of your savings into DeAndre's campaign account immediately. Consider it a late rent payment. Consider it an apology for your disgraceful behavior on Sunday. I do not care how you frame it. Transfer the money right now, or you are officially dead to this family. You will never set foot on our property again. I stared at the binder of federal evidence sitting on my desk, containing the exact documents that proved I now owned the very properties they were trying to steal. My mother was threatening to disown me over a few thousand imaginary dollars, completely oblivious to the fact that I held the entire financial fate of their lives in the palm of my hand. Every single brutal insult she had ever hurled at me, every single time she had chosen Chloe over me, flashed rapidly through my mind in vivid detail. I took a slow, measured breath, preparing to deliver the cold response that would permanently sever my emotional ties to them forever. I will not transfer a single cent to DeAndre or Chloe, I said into the receiver. My voice was perfectly flat, an impenetrable wall of absolute finality. I am not a charity fund for your golden child's failing husband, Mother. If the caterers walk out tonight, then DeAndre can serve his wealthy political donors tap water and insincere apologies. The silence on the other end of the line lasted for exactly 3 seconds. Then Yvonne erupted. The polished country club facade completely dissolved, revealing the vicious, resentful woman hiding beneath the expensive silk blouses and pearl necklaces. She shrieked into the phone, her voice cracking with an unhinged feral rage that forced me to hold the receiver an inch away from my ear. How dare you speak to me like that? Yvonne screamed, hurling decades of venom directly at my head. You selfish, ungrateful wretch. You have always been nothing but a stubborn burden to this family. You were always too dark, too stubborn, and too ugly to marry well. We knew you would never secure a wealthy husband like Chloe did. We knew you would end up alone playing in the dirt, embarrassing us at every turn. Chloe did everything right, and you owe her. She elevated our name. She married a future state senator. You owe her your complete subservience. You owe this family every penny you scraped together, because without us you are absolutely nothing. I listened to her toxic tirade without interrupting. I did not cry. I did not feel the familiar crushing ache of childhood rejection that used to paralyze me whenever she weaponized my appearance or my independence. Instead, I felt a profound, chilling emptiness. The invisible heavy chain of obligation that had bound me to these people for 35 years simply snapped. They had chosen their side long ago. They had chosen the illusion of power over their own flesh and blood. You are right about one thing, Mother, I replied softly, my tone carrying the absolute chill of a winter storm. I am entirely done playing my part in your sick family dynamic. Do not ever call this number again. I ended the call. I placed the phone face down on my polished marble desk and took a deep cleansing breath. The emotional detachment was complete. I was no longer the wounded daughter seeking validation from parents who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. I was the chief executive officer of Vanguard Heritage Holdings, and I was about to surgically dismantle their entire fraudulent empire. While Yvonne was busy screaming at me over the phone demanding my imaginary meager savings, DeAndre was in a state of absolute sweating panic across town. My intelligence network within the Atlanta financial sector was vast, and my analysts had been tracking his frantic movements all morning. DeAndre was completely out of options. The $300,000 debt he owed to the offshore gambling syndicate in Nassau was due immediately, and the collectors were no longer accepting his smooth political promises. Chloe's rushed under-the-table sale of Grandpa Elijah's downtown commercial lots was supposed to provide his salvation, but that money was deliberately stalled in escrow by my legal team. Driven by pure desperation and the terrifying reality of his impending physical and political destruction, DeAndre made a fatal, unrecoverable error. He completely bypassed Chloe and her forged power of attorney. Instead, he approached a shadow lender, a predatory private equity firm known for issuing high-interest short-term bridge loans to desperate clients with no questions asked. DeAndre leveraged the entirety of Grandpa Elijah's historic estate as collateral for an immediate cash injection. Because he lacked the legal authority to encumber the property, DeAndre committed his own brazen act of federal fraud. He forged my father Calvin's signature as the primary guarantor on the loan documents. The sheer audacity of the crime was staggering. The family was literally cannibalizing itself out of pure, unfiltered greed. Chloe was forging Grandpa Elijah's name to sell his commercial lots. Calvin had secretly placed a massive tax lien on the estate years ago to cover his own stock market failures. And now DeAndre was forging Calvin's signature to mortgage the very same property to pay off illegal gambling debts. They were a circle of thieves blindly stealing from one another while the ship rapidly sank. I sat at my desk, watching the digital readouts on my dual monitors, track the incoming data from our escrow officers and financial acquisitions team. The intricate web of lies my family had constructed was collapsing under its own massive weight. They had built a house of cards on a foundation of deceit, and I held the match that would burn it all down to the ash. My office door swung open with a soft, authoritative click. Marcus, my lead acquisitions attorney, strode into the room holding a thick-bound stack of freshly printed legal documents. His expression was a mixture of absolute professional triumph and grim satisfaction. He placed the heavy binder directly in the center of my desk, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the leather blotting pad. "We have them," Zuri Marcus announced, his voice carrying the thrill of a flawless victory. "The trap is completely sealed. Chloe just signed the closing papers for the commercial lots. The money has been transferred, and she committed federal wire fraud. We have her signature, her digital footprint, and the IP address from DeAndre's campaign headquarters. The federal indictment practically writes itself." I opened the heavy binder, trailing my index finger over the crisp ink of the purchase agreement. I now legally owned the commercial lots they had tried to steal. "What about DeAndre?" I asked, not looking up from the pages. Marcus smiled, pulling a separate red folder from beneath his arm and dropping it next to the first binder. DeAndre took the bait perfectly. When the funds from Chloe's sale did not hit his account fast enough to pay off his syndicate handlers, he panicked. He took out a massive predatory bridge loan against your grandfather's estate. He forged your father Calvin's signature as the sole guarantor. "And the debt?" I prompted, turning my gaze to meet his. "Acquired," Marcus confirmed, tapping the red folder. Vanguard Heritage Holdings maintains several anonymous subsidiary investment arms for exactly this type of aggressive acquisition. The predatory lender DeAndre used is highly motivated by fast liquidity. We approached them an hour ago and offered to buy the debt outright at a 20% premium. They transferred the loan originations to our subsidiary without a second thought. We also just bought the debt on DeAndre's bridge loan. Because DeAndre immediately defaulted on the stringent ethical clauses of the contract by committing forgery, the loan is instantly callable. You now hold the mortgage to Elijah's estate. You are officially their landlord, their creditor, and their absolute worst nightmare. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the absolute magnitude of the moment. My family had spent my entire life trying to make me feel incredibly small. They had evicted me, humiliated me in front of wealthy donors, and tried to strip me of my inheritance and my dignity. They had underestimated my intelligence, dismissed my career, and mocked my appearance. They thought I was a helpless, wayward soul they could easily discard when I was no longer a convenient prop for their false narrative of perfection. Instead, I had quietly built an empire. I had outmaneuvered them at every single turn. I had let their own insatiable greed guide them directly into an inescapable legal and financial prison of my own design. I now owned the properties Chloe tried to steal. I held the mortgage DeAndre fraudulently secured. I possessed the evidence of Calvin's secret tax lien. I had everything I needed to dismantle their lives completely. I slowly closed the heavy legal binders, the sound echoing with a satisfying thud in the quiet expanse of my penthouse office. I looked at the sleek silver watch secured around my wrist. It was exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The massive, extravagant campaign gala DeAndre and Chloe were hosting to secure their political future was scheduled to begin in exactly 3 hours. The catering staff they could barely afford would be setting up the crystal champagne flutes. The wealthy donors they were desperately trying to impress would be putting on their expensive tuxedos and designer gowns. The entire elite society of Atlanta was preparing to descend upon my grandfather's estate to celebrate a profound lie. Perfect timing for their gala tonight, I said softly, a genuine chilling smile finally breaking across my face. Marcus nodded, matching my cold expression. Do you want me to initiate the foreclosure proceedings and contact the federal authorities now, or wait until Monday morning? I stood up, smoothing my blazer. We are not waiting until Monday, Marcus, I replied. We are going to hand-deliver the news personally. We are leaving now. The elevator descent from the penthouse was swift and entirely silent. Marcus stood beside me, his briefcase locked tight, holding the financial execution of my family. We stepped out into the subterranean parking garage of Vanguard, where my private security detail waited beside a fleet of black Maybachs. This was a night for absolute dominance. I slipped into the rear cabin of the lead vehicle. Waiting for me was a garment bag holding my armor for the evening. A custom $10,000 emerald green silk gown designed to catch every flashbulb and command every eye in the room. I changed quickly in the luxurious privacy of the heavily tinted cabin as the powerful convoy rolled out. I swept my hair into a flawless twist and fastened a heavy diamond collar around my neck. These were not rented jewels. They were the spoils of relentless empire building. Marcus handed me freshly stamped legal injunctions. I distributed them to the massive security contractors sitting in the jump seats. I gave my instructions with absolute clarity. No one touches my grandfather. No one leaves with family assets. We execute the foreclosure documents the second I give the signal. The men nodded, strictly professional. We parked exactly 1 block away, idling out of sight of the chaotic media circus. Meanwhile, Grandpa Elijah's historic property had been entirely transformed into a blinding theater of political desperation. Massive Klieg lights swept across the lawns. A dozen local news vans were parked along the circular driveway, their satellite dishes raised toward the night sky. The elite of Atlanta society were pouring through the double doors, a sea of expensive tuxedos, glittering dresses, and ruthless ambition. DeAndre had somehow pulled every political favor he had left to pack the room with influential state officials and high-net-worth donors. Inside the foyer, Chloe was performing the role of a lifetime. Draped in rented diamonds that sparkled under the chandeliers, wearing a skin-tight scarlet dress, she clung tightly to DeAndre's arm. She threw her head back and practiced laughter at jokes she did not find funny. She aggressively networked, whispering sweet promises of political favors into the ears of wealthy businessmen, completely unaware that she had sold her soul and her future for $800,000 of stolen cash currently sitting in a Vanguard holding account. My parents, Calvin and Yvonne, were equally complicit in the sickening charade. Positioned near the open bar, they aggressively schmoozed state senators. Calvin held a glass of expensive scotch, laughing loudly, projecting the image of a wealthy patriarch. Yvonne casually lied to the wives of local pastors about her philanthropic work. They were celebrating a victory built entirely on quicksand. In the midst of this glittering chaos, the true owner of the estate sat entirely abandoned. Grandpa Elijah had been parked in a dark, drafty corner of the hallway, right next to the swinging kitchen doors. The catering staff rushed past, entirely ignoring the elderly man whose home they were occupying. Calvin and Yvonne had not checked on him once. Chloe explicitly ordered the nursing staff to stay out of sight, not wanting the messy reality of his dementia to ruin her aesthetic. He sat playing the tragic invalid, perfectly waiting for the match to strike. Chloe excused herself from a donor and marched toward the front door. She pulled the head of her private security detail aside. "I have a very specific non-negotiable order," she hissed, vibrating with paranoid tension. "My sister Zuri is severely unstable and highly dangerous. She has been stalking the property. If she shows up at those gates tonight, you do not talk to her. You do not reason with her. You immediately call the Atlanta police and have her arrested for criminal trespassing. I want her thrown in a holding cell before dessert is served. Do I make myself clear?" The security chief nodded briskly. Chloe smiled, smoothing down her scarlet dress, genuinely believing she had secured her fortress. She thought I was sitting in some cheap motel, mourning the loss of my family. She thought her smear campaign had broken my spirit. Back in the Maybach, I watched the dashboard clock click exactly to 8 o'clock, the peak arrival time for Platinum Tier campaign sponsors. I tapped the partition glass. "Move in," I instructed my driver. The engine purred very smoothly as the heavy armored vehicle glided forward, followed seamlessly by the accompanying Maybachs. We rolled up the long oak-lined avenue leading to the main gates. The flashing cameras of the local press corps immediately swiveled toward us, sensing the arrival of massive wealth. The perimeter guards stepped forward, holding up their hands to halt the imposing convoy. My driver rolled down the window just enough to hand the guard a heavy black envelope. The guard opened it, his eyes widening at the enclosed platinum sponsorship credentials. Vanguard Heritage Holdings was listed as the largest financial backer of the evening. It was a completely fabricated document my legal team drafted an hour ago, but it looked incredibly official. The guard scrambled for his radio, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "Ma'am, we have a massive situation at the front gate." He barked over the secure channel into Chloe's earpiece. "We have a convoy of 3 black Maybachs pulling up right now. They are demanding entry. They claim to be the top-tier platinum sponsors from a corporate holding firm." Inside the foyer, Chloe heard the radio transmission. Her eyes instantly lit up with pure, unfiltered greed. A convoy of Maybachs meant unimaginable life-saving cash. It meant her desperate prayers had finally been answered. She abandoned the senator, signaling for DeAndre to follow her. "Open the gates!" Chloe shouted into her radio, shrill with excitement. "Open the gates right now and clear the driveway. Have the valet stand down. I will greet them personally at the front steps. Bring them straight up." She ran toward the massive double doors, throwing them wide open and stepping onto the grand portico. The news cameras clustered around the steps began flashing rapidly, capturing the perfect political wife, welcoming her financial saviors. DeAndre hurried up right behind her, pasting on his most humble smile. Calvin and Yvonne abandoned the open bar and joined them on the porch. The entire family stood together, united in their absolute worship of money. The massive iron gates slowly swung open for us. My driver navigated the circular driveway with practiced precision, tires crunching loudly over gravel. The 3 Maybachs glided to a flawless halt directly in front of the sweeping marble staircase. The flashing cameras reached a frantic crescendo. The crowd of elite donors pressed against the windows, eager to see which billionaire had arrived to save DeAndre's sinking ship. Chloe beamed, radiating absolute triumph. She took a step down the marble stairs, extending her arms in a gesture of magnanimous welcome. "Welcome to our home," she projected loudly, ensuring the press corps captured every syllable. "We are so incredibly honored to have your profound support tonight." My security detail stepped out of the secondary vehicles first. 4 men in tailored black suits seamlessly formed a protective wall between my car and the paparazzi. Marcus stepped out next, holding the thick red binder containing their financial execution. He walked around to my side of the vehicle and opened the heavy armored door. I stepped out of the Maybach. My emerald green silk gown cascaded down to the gravel. The diamond collar around my neck caught the blinding glare of the camera flashes, throwing fractured light directly into Chloe's eyes. I stood perfectly straight, rolling my shoulders back, and looked up the marble staircase at my family. The silence that instantly crashed down over the grand portico was absolute and deafening. It was as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the atmosphere. The news cameras stopped clicking. The murmuring crowd froze in place. Chloe's welcoming, arrogant smile completely died. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a corpse wrapped in scarlet silk. Her arms slowly dropped limply to her sides. She stared at my designer gown, my security detail, and the undeniable aura of absolute power radiating from my stance. DeAndre physically staggered backward, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Calvin dropped his glass of scotch. It shattered loudly against the marble steps, the amber liquid pooling around his shoes. Yvonne clutched her chest, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. They were staring at the ghost they had tried to bury, returning as a queen to claim her throne. I did not break eye contact with my trembling sister. I slowly walked up the first marble step, the sound of my heels striking the stone echoing like a gunshot in the silent night. "Good evening, Chloe," I finally said, my voice carrying clearly across the frozen crowd. "I believe we have some very urgent real estate matters to discuss." I brushed past Chloe, the heavy emerald silk of my custom gown whispering against her trembling legs. She remained completely paralyzed on the marble steps, her jaw slack, her eyes wide with a terror that finally matched the deep ugliness of her soul. I did not wait for her to formulate a frantic, stuttering response. I stepped gracefully over the shattered crystal of my father's dropped scotch, ascending the final stairs and walking directly through the towering double doors of my grandfather's historic home. The grand ballroom was a blinding theater of absolute excess. DeAndre and Chloe had spared no expense spending stolen money to rent towering arrangements of imported white orchids, draping the historic mahogany banisters in expensive silk ribbons, and hiring a string quartet that played softly in the corner. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with the absolute elite of Atlanta. I recognized state senators, powerful real estate moguls, and wealthy political donors, whom my family had desperately courted for years. As I stepped into the radiant light of the massive crystal chandelier, the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. The low hum of affluent conversation abruptly died, replaced by a stunned electric silence. I did not hesitate. I walked forward, my chin held high, my posture projecting the absolute undeniable authority I had painstakingly earned. The sea of expensive tuxedos and designer gowns naturally, almost magnetically parted for me. I walked through the center of the grand ballroom like Moses parting the Red Sea. My personal security detail flanked me with flawless military precision, creating an impenetrable wall of dark suits that dwarfed the wealthy guests scrambling to get out of my way. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted him. Tucked away in a dark, drafty alcove near the swinging kitchen doors, entirely isolated from the glittering celebration, sat Grandpa Elijah. He was slumped in his wheelchair, wearing a faded cardigan, looking confused by the flashing lights and the sea of strangers occupying his cherished home. My heart fiercely tightened at the sight of his neglect. Calvin and Yvonne had pushed him into a shadow so his declining health would not ruin their perfect political aesthetic. I caught my grandfather's eye for a fraction of a second. He blinked, a faint spark of recognition cutting through his dementia. I offered him a slow, silent nod. I was taking our home back. Suddenly, the frantic, sharp clicking of designer heels echoed rapidly across the hardwood floor. Chloe had finally snapped out of her paralytic shock. She came tearing into the ballroom, frantically pushing past a group of wealthy donors, her scarlet silk dress catching on the edge of a catering table. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow gasps. She desperately forced a grotesque, strained smile onto her face for the benefit of the staring politicians, but the muscles in her cheeks were violently twitching. Her eyes were completely wild, feral with the realization that she was entirely losing control of her meticulously crafted narrative. She intercepted me exactly in the center of the room. Chloe leaned in close, her expensive floral perfume entirely failing to mask the sharp, acrid scent of her mounting panic. She grabbed my forearm, her manicured acrylic nails digging painfully into my skin as she hissed through her terrifying frozen smile. "I told you to stay away from here!" Chloe spat, her voice vibrating with a venomous, unhinged rage that only I could hear. "Security escort this vagrant off my property immediately!" She threw her hand out, gesturing frantically toward the men in black uniforms stationed around the perimeter of the ballroom. Two estate guards instinctively took a step forward, reaching toward their communication radios. But before they could even cross the threshold of the dance floor, my personal security team moved. It was a flawless, intimidating blockade. My men smoothly stepped directly into the path of the approaching guards, crossing their arms over their broad chests. The sheer physical disparity was almost comical. The estate guards immediately froze, recognizing that any attempt to forcibly remove me would end in their absolute destruction. They slowly backed away, lowering their hands, completely surrendering their authority. Chloe gasped, her fake smile finally collapsing into an expression of profound, unadulterated horror. She looked frantically around the room, realizing that the very men she had hired to protect her were refusing to obey her direct commands. The wealthy donors and politicians were now openly staring, whispering behind their champagne flutes, watching the supposed golden child of the family entirely unravel in the center of her own political gala. A catering waiter, frozen by the sudden tension, happened to be standing to my left, holding a silver tray. I calmly reached out and took a crystal flute of champagne. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the sparkling wine cool my throat, before I turned my gaze back to my hyperventilating sister. "Your property?" I asked softly, my voice carrying clearly across the absolute silence of the grand ballroom. I tilted my head, looking at her with a mixture of cold pity and victorious amusement. "Chloe, you really should have read the fine print on the catering event and security contracts you so eagerly signed for tonight." Her breath hitched. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, the remaining color draining rapidly from her face. "You thought you were dealing with a web of independent contractors," I explained, taking another casual sip of my champagne. "You hired Apex Event Solutions to provide the floral arrangements and the string quartet. You hired Sentinel Protection Services to guard the gates. You secured the bridge loan through a private equity firm that promised no questions asked. You are so blinded by your own desperate vanity that you never bothered to check the parent companies." I took a step closer, forcing Chloe to instinctively retreat. "I own Vanguard Heritage Holdings, Chloe. Apex Event Solutions is a wholly owned subsidiary of my firm. Sentinel Protection Services operates exclusively under my corporate umbrella. I employ these guards you are currently screaming at. I own the private equity firm that holds the fraudulent mortgage." DeAndre signed, using Calvin's forged signature. "And as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, I officially own the commercial downtown lots you sold using a forged power of attorney." Chloe physically staggered backward, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. The diamond bracelets on her wrists clinked together, a hollow, mocking sound. "You do not own this estate," I continued, my voice echoing like a judge reading a final sentence. "You do not own the land. You do not even own the catering trays passing around the room. You are absolutely nothing but a guest at my party, and your invitation has just been permanently revoked." Before Chloe could collapse entirely, the crowd violently parted again. Calvin stormed through the throng of wealthy guests, pushing past a state senator without a single word of apology. His face was a mottled, dangerous shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched white collar. He had witnessed the entire exchange from the foyer, and the realization that his patriarchal authority had been completely dismantled by the daughter he despised drove him into a state of absolute blinding fury. He marched directly up to me, aggressively invading my personal space, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, just as he had done my entire childhood. He pointed a trembling, thick finger directly at my face. "I do not care what little shell game you are playing, Zuri," Calvin roared, completely abandoning any pretense of upper-class decorum. Saliva flew from his lips, landing on the polished hardwood floor. "You are trespassing on my family's historic estate. You have embarrassed us for the absolute last time. I am calling the chief of police right now to have you arrested and dragged out of here in handcuffs." He reached into the breast pocket of his expensive tuxedo, wildly pulling out his cell phone. He was shaking so violently with rage that he nearly dropped the device. He glared at me, expecting me to cower, expecting me to beg for his forgiveness, expecting the obedient, frightened daughter to finally submit to his aggressive demands. Instead, I looked at the man who had spent his entire life tearing me down, who had secretly placed a massive tax lien on his own father's home, who had allowed his golden child to forge documents and commit federal crimes just to preserve his fragile ego. I felt absolutely no fear. I felt nothing but a cold, heavy sense of absolute power. I offered my father a freezing, victorious smile. "Please do, Dad," I replied, my voice steady, sharp, and entirely unbothered. "It will save me the trouble of calling him myself." Calvin stood immobilized by the coldness of my response. The veins in his neck throbbed against his starched collar, but the blustering patriarch who had dominated my existence was suddenly robbed of his voice. He had expected me to shrink, to apologize, to beg for my place back within this deeply toxic family. Instead, I had effortlessly dismissed his ultimate threat with terrifying indifference. His mouth opened and closed, producing nothing but sharp, jagged breaths. I did not afford him the luxury of another single second of my attention. I turned my back on my father, dismissing him completely forever. The heavy emerald silk of my custom gown swept across the polished hardwood floors as I resumed my calculated march through the center of the grand ballroom. The sea of wealthy donors, elite socialites, and influential state politicians continued to part before me. Their eyes were wide with insatiable, morbid curiosity. They could smell the impending destruction, and they were utterly captivated by it. My private security detail flanked me with flawless precision. They were a moving wall of absolute authority that completely insulated me from the whispering crowd. I kept my gaze locked squarely on the stage area directly. At the far end of the grand ballroom, elevated on a lavishly decorated temporary stage, DeAndre was in the middle of delivering his keynote address. He stood behind a clear acrylic podium bathed in the warm glow of professional stage lighting. He looked the part of the perfect, trustworthy political candidate. His tailored tuxedo fit impeccably, his posture was commanding, and his gleaming white smile was working overtime to charm the hundreds of wealthy checkbooks sitting in the audience. He was gesturing expansively, weaving a masterful, sickeningly false narrative about community legacy and the profound importance of strong familial bonds. He spoke passionately about Grandpa Elijah, referencing the elderly man parked in the dark hallway as his ultimate inspiration, his guiding light, and the moral compass of his entire campaign. The sheer hypocrisy of his words made my stomach churn with violent disgust. He was standing in my grandfather's home, spending my grandfather's money, and using my grandfather's sterling reputation to purchase political power, all while secretly planning to throw the man into a substandard state facility the moment the checks cleared. DeAndre was completely blind to the silent emerald green storm rapidly approaching the brightly illuminated wooden stage steps. I reached the base of the temporary stage without encountering a single ounce of resistance. The event staff and political aides hovering near the stairs took one look at my hardened expression and the imposing physical presence of my security team and immediately stepped backward, melting into the shadows. I placed my hand on the polished silver railing and began to ascend the stairs. The rhythmic, confident sound of my heels striking the wooden steps finally broke through. DeAndre's narcissistic trance. He paused mid-political sentence, his perfectly manicured eyebrows drawing together in mild annoyance at the completely unexpected interruption. He turned his head expecting to see a confused caterer or an overzealous campaign manager. Instead, his gaze locked directly onto me. The smooth, practiced political smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a look of profound, uncomprehending shock. He stared at my emerald gown, the diamonds resting against my collarbone, and the absolute chilling calmness radiating from my eyes. He blinked rapidly, desperately trying to process how the woman he had always considered a pathetic, dusty failure had suddenly bypassed his heavy security and arrived looking like absolute royalty. He opened his mouth to speak his panicked mind. He perhaps intended to issue a sharp reprimand or call for his guards, but I did not grant him the opportunity. I stepped directly up to the acrylic podium, invading his carefully curated spotlight. I did not say a single word to him. I did not need to. My actions were swift, decisive, and entirely humiliating. I reached forward, my hand moving with practiced certainty, and gripped the thick black cable connecting his primary microphone to the sound system. With one sharp, deliberate yank, I unplugged his microphone. The loud, booming resonance of his political speech was instantly permanently severed. His voice was replaced by a jarring pop of static that echoed terribly across the massive ballroom. DeAndre stumbled backward, physically recoiling from the podium, as if the acrylic structure had suddenly caught fire. He looked down at the severed black cord resting in my manicured hand, his eyes wide with rising, uncontrollable panic. The hundreds of wealthy guests sitting in the ballroom gasped in collective shock, murmuring in confusion as their candidate was abruptly silenced. I completely ignored his terrified, stammering attempts to regain control of the stage. I turned my back on his pathetic display without any hesitation. I walked purposefully toward the corner of the elevated platform, where the event DJ sat behind a massive soundboard. The young DJ, wearing oversized headphones and a panicked expression, watched me approach, like a deer caught in the headlights. My lead security guard stepped up beside me, silently crossing his massive arms. The DJ immediately raised his hands in a gesture of absolute surrender and hurriedly stepped away from his intricate equipment. I stepped up to the soundboard, my eyes quickly scanning the maze of sliders, dials, and digital displays. I located the primary auxiliary input port audio connection point. It was connected directly to the master speakers that surrounded the ballroom. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown and retrieved my sleek smartphone. I plugged the auxiliary cable securely into the bottom of my device. I unlocked the screen, my thumb hovering over the audio file I had meticulously extracted from the encrypted USB drive I found hidden inside Grandpa Elijah's antique mahogany desk. This was the irrefutable, undeniable truth. This was the poison they had secretly whispered in the shadows, finally brought out into the blinding, unforgiving light of day. I pushed the audio master slider. I pushed the volume control all the way to its maximum limit. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing to permanently detonate the fraudulent lives of the people who had tried to bury me. I pressed play. The audio recording hissed with a brief second of static before booming through the massive, high-fidelity speakers with crystal-clear acoustic precision. Chloe's sharp, callous, and instantly recognizable voice echoed through the grand ballroom, bouncing violently off the crystal chandeliers and historic walls. Just double his sedatives, so he signs the power of attorney. The old man is practically a vegetable anyway. The ballroom descended into a state of absolute horrifying silence. The clinking of champagne glasses ceased entirely. The elite of Atlanta froze, paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of the words hanging heavily in the air. But the recording was not finished. DeAndre's smooth, arrogant baritone voice immediately followed, booming through the speakers with sickening clarity. Once we get the money, we'll stick him in a state home. These church idiots will vote for me regardless. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic. The highly respected megachurch pastor physically dropped his gilded event program. He looked disgusted. The wealthy political donors, the men and women who had written massive checks based on DeAndre's fabricated family values, began pulling out their smartphones, rapidly recording the unfolding disaster. An angry, deeply offended murmur swept through the room, quickly escalating into a loud, undeniable chorus of outrage and profound, intense, unyielding revulsion. Right now, near the open bar, Calvin and Yvonne stood perfectly rigid, looking exactly like they had just seen a terrifying, inescapable ghost. The pristine, untouchable illusion of their perfect golden child had vaporized. It left behind the ugly core of greedy souls laid entirely, completely bare tonight. On the stage, the reality of his total destruction finally crashed down on DeAndre. He was sweating profusely, thick beads of moisture rolling down his forehead, completely ruining his expensive camera-ready makeup. His chest heaved with frantic, terrified breaths. Driven by panic, he leaped across the stage toward the DJ booth. He lunged forward and ripped the auxiliary cord out of my phone. The audio cut off with a screech, but the damage had been inflicted. The truth was out. DeAndre scrambled across the platform, grabbing a microphone. He turned to face the crowd, highly agitated, fully, utterly ruined. His eyes were completely manic, and his voice was booming with a very unhinged desperation. He gripped the plastic microphone stand with both hands, his knuckles turning stark white under the intense stage lighting. The entire ballroom stared at him, collectively holding their breath, as he desperately tried to salvage the ashes of his meticulously crafted political empire. He shouted into the mic, "It's a fake. It's AI. My sister-in-law is a jealous, psychotic dropout who made a deep fake to ruin my career." He turns to Chloe for backup. "Show them the legal papers, Chloe. Show them we are legitimate." Chloe physically flinched at the volume of her husband's terrified screaming. For a split second, the polished, aristocratic mask slipped completely, revealing the cornered, desperate animal underneath. The flashing camera bulbs from the local press corps illuminated the sheer panic pooling in her eyes. But decades of absolute entitlement and blind arrogance possess a powerful momentum. She could not accept defeat. She refused to be publicly dismantled by the sister she had spent a lifetime treating like discarded trash. Chloe frantically ripped open the clasp of her diamond-encrusted designer purse. Her perfectly manicured nails scraped against the expensive leather as she dug blindly inside. She bypassed the lipsticks and mirror, her hands shaking violently, until her fingers finally closed around the thick folded parchment paper she had been carrying around like a political shield. She yanked the documents out of her purse, nearly tearing the edges in her manic haste. These were the finalized escrow papers, the deed of sale, and the heavily forged power of attorney she had used to liquidate Grandpa Elijah's commercial properties. She thrust her arm high into the air, waving the stark white papers frantically at the sea of bewildered journalists, stunned mega-church pastors, and horrified political donors. "I have the legal power of attorney!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the silent, cavernous ballroom. The elegant acoustics of the historic space twisted her panicked tone into something entirely unhinged. She pointed a trembling finger at the documents in her own hand, shaking them so violently they produced a sharp snapping sound. "I sold my grandfather's commercial lots to a massive, highly legitimate corporate holding group yesterday afternoon. I secured the cash to protect this estate and secure our family's future. I am the one holding us together." She then turned her venomous gaze directly toward me, her face contorting with a desperate, ugly rage. She leveled her accusing finger at my emerald green gown. "Zuri is nothing but a broke, bitter liar. She is a jealous, pathetic dropout who has spent her entire miserable life resenting my success. She engineered this entire disgusting stunt just to steal our shine and ruin DeAndre's big night, because she has absolutely nothing of value in her own pathetic existence. Do not listen to a single word she says. Look at these papers. These papers are real. The money is real. We are saving this community." I did not yell. I did not raise my voice to match her hysterical pitch. I simply stood there, absorbing the absolute pathetic nature of her final desperate defense. The massive crowd of Atlanta elites held their collective breath, their eyes darting rapidly between Chloe's frantic sweating display and my completely immobile ice-cold posture. Slowly, deliberately, I unclasped my own sleek velvet clutch. I reached inside and pulled out a tightly banded stack of heavy matte black business cards. The cards were bordered in metallic silver, embossed with a crisp, minimalist corporate logo. I did not look at Chloe. Instead, I gave a brief, silent nod to the towering leader of my personal security detail standing at the base of the stage. He moved immediately, stepping forward with absolute military precision. He took the stack of black cards from my hand. He gestured to the 3 other heavily armed guards flanking the platform. They moved seamlessly into the front row of the frozen audience, moving directly toward the prominent journalists, the lead political correspondents, and the wealthiest donors who had bankrolled DeAndre's fraudulent campaign. The guards began silently distributing the black business cards, pressing the heavy cardstock directly into the hands of the bewildered media members. The journalists immediately flipped the cards over, reading the silver-embossed text under the bright ballroom chandeliers. A collective audible wave of realization rippled through the front rows. Whispers ignited like a sudden brush fire, spreading rapidly backward through the dense crowd of attendees. People were pointing at the cards, pointing at me, and then looking back at Chloe with expressions of absolute, unadulterated horror. I stepped forward, bypassing the disconnected DJ equipment, and picked up the secondary microphone resting on the backup soundboard. I flipped the power switch. The green indicator light flared to life. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice, amplified through the massive venue speakers, dripped with absolute, freezing ice. "Look at the buyer's name on that specific contract you are waving around." Chloe, I commanded. My tone was not angry. It was the clinical, detached tone of an executioner reading a final verdict. "Look at the exact corporate entity that wired those funds into your heavily monitored escrow account yesterday afternoon." Chloe froze. Her eyes darted down to the crumpled documents clutched in her trembling fist. She stared at the bold black ink identifying the acquiring party. Vanguard Heritage Holdings. I pointed a single steady finger directly at the black business cards now firmly gripped in the hands of the frantic reporters below the stage. I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Heritage Holdings. I declared boldly, the absolute truth striking the ballroom like a massive physical shockwave. The entire corporate holding company belongs exclusively to me. I built it from the ground up while you were busy playing dress up and mocking my existence. You did not sell those commercial properties to a faceless corporation to save this family, Chloe. You did not secure any future. You fell directly into a legally binding, heavily documented trap of my own design. You committed federal wire fraud by selling stolen family assets directly to me. The crowd gasped loudly in unison. Several of the elderly church members actually clutched their pearls, stumbling backward in pure shock. The journalists immediately began snapping photos of the business cards, then swinging their heavy camera lenses directly toward Chloe's horrified, bloodless face. The sheer scale of the deception, the absolute perfection of the corporate ambush, hung heavy in the opulent air. Chloe dropped the forged documents. The heavy parchment papers fluttered slowly to the polished hardwood floor, landing right at her trembling designer-clad feet. She could not breathe. She was completely paralyzed, trapped inside the nightmare she had arrogantly constructed. Her knees buckled slightly, unable to support the crushing weight of her immediate, inescapable downfall. She looked like a puppet whose strings had just been violently severed by an unseen hand. The grand facade of the successful political wife, the dutiful granddaughter, the golden child of the family was completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, exposed criminal. The air in the grand ballroom felt incredibly thin, vibrating with the electric charge of absolute total destruction. DeAndre had retreated to the far corner of the stage, his hands gripping his hair, his political career visibly disintegrating into fine ash before his very eyes. He looked desperately toward the major political donors standing near the front row, searching for any glimmer of lingering support, but he found absolutely nothing except profound revulsion and outright disgust. The wealthy men and women who had written massive checks to his campaign were already whispering frantically to their respective spouses, undoubtedly calculating exactly how quickly they could publicly distance themselves from this monumental, catastrophic scandal. The flashing cameras continued their relentless, blinding assault, capturing every single angle of my family's total, humiliating ruin. I stood perfectly still on the elevated platform, the heavy emerald silk of my custom gown pooling elegantly around my feet, feeling the glorious, undeniable weight of total victory. I had not just defeated them. I had surgically dismantled their entire false reality. Down on the main floor, the initial shock holding the crowd hostage finally began to fracture. Shouts erupted from the press pool. Reporters were shoving digital recorders forward, demanding immediate statements from the disgraced candidate and his fraudulent wife. The carefully orchestrated high society campaign gala had officially devolved into a chaotic, unmanageable crime scene. Waiters carrying silver trays of expensive hot appetizers abandoned their posts, staring openly at the stage. The string quartet in the corner had abruptly stopped playing mid-performance, their bows resting loosely against their instruments. Every eye in the room, hundreds of piercing, judgmental stares were locked onto the spectacular destruction of my sister and her husband. The private security team I employed stood their ground with stoic discipline, forming an impenetrable barrier that kept the surging media away from the stage steps, ensuring my complete safety while my family drowned in their own toxic, self-inflicted disaster. The echo of my father's furious declaration bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom, lingering in the heavy, suffocating air. The wealthy donors, the terrified politicians, and the scheming family members all stared at me, waiting for my reaction. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply lowered my heavy microphone and looked directly past Calvin's dark purple, profusely sweating face, deliberately directing my sharp gaze straight toward the extremely dark, entirely forgotten alcove near the swinging kitchen doors. A sharp, distinct sound sliced right through the lingering echoes of Calvin's rage. It was the sound of a throat clearing. It was a firm, commanding, and deeply authoritative rumble that demanded immediate, absolute silence. Every single head in the massive ballroom swiveled simultaneously toward the shadows. The local press corps adjusted their heavy camera lenses, struggling to capture whatever was emerging from the darkness. Grandpa Elijah sat in his wheelchair, the posture of the defeated dementia-riddled invalid entirely gone. He gripped the armrests of his medical chair with large, steady hands. His knuckles whitened slightly as he applied pressure. Then in front of hundreds of stunned, paralyzed guests, my grandfather pushed himself up. He did not stumble. He did not hesitate. He did not reach for the aluminum cane resting against the wall. Grandpa Elijah stood up perfectly straight, rolling his broad shoulders back, instantly regaining the towering, imposing physical presence that had built a massive real estate empire from absolutely nothing. The vacant, confused fog that had supposedly clouded his mind for the past 2 years vanished entirely. His dark eyes were incredibly sharp, utterly lucid and burning with a terrifying righteous fury. A collective horrifying gasp swept through the crowd of Atlanta elites. State senators physically recoiled, knocking over crystal champagne flutes that shattered loudly against the polished hardwood floor. The caterers froze in place. The flashing camera bulbs suddenly multiplied, capturing the impossible resurrection of the patriarch everyone assumed was already essentially dead. I took a single step forward. His stride was long, confident, and entirely steady. He possessed the unstoppable momentum of a king who had finally decided to reclaim his stolen throne. Grandpa Elijah walked out of the shadows and directly into the blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers. The sea of expensive tuxedos and designer gowns parted for him even faster than they had parted for me. People pressed themselves flat against the catering tables, and the historic mahogany walls terrified to even accidentally brush against the furious patriarch. Calvin physically staggered backward, as if he had just been struck by a high-speed train. His mouth fell wide open, forming a silent, pathetic circle of pure, unadulterated terror. He bumped heavily into Yvonne, who let out a shrill, strangled shriek, her hands flying up to cover her heavily made-up face. She looked exactly as though the ground had opened up to swallow her whole. Near the edge of the stage, Chloe completely lost whatever tiny fragment of sanity she had left. She scrambled backward, her expensive scarlet dress tangling around her trembling legs, until her spine hit the wooden scaffolding of the platform. She stared at her grandfather, shaking violently, her eyes wide with a manic, cornered panic. DeAndre remained frozen near the DJ booth, his political career officially dead and buried, watching the man he had called a vegetable march toward him with the wrath of the Old Testament. Grandpa Elijah reached the wooden stairs of the temporary stage. He did not even glance at the terrified estate guards or my stoic security detail. He ascended the steps with practiced ease, his heavy shoes thudding rhythmically against the hollow wood. I stepped aside respectfully, lowering my head as he approached the clear acrylic podium. I held out the microphone. He took it from my hand, his grip warm and incredibly strong. He turned to face the massive, paralyzed crowd. He looked directly down at his sweating, trembling son. "I am in my right mind," Calvin Grandpa Elijah said. His deep, resonant voice boomed through the massive venue speakers, carrying absolutely zero trace of frailty or confusion. His tone was a devastating mixture of profound disappointment and absolute lethal authority. "I am completely, entirely lucid. I have been lucid every single day for the past 2 years." Calvin let out a pathetic whimpering sound, practically collapsing against a tall cocktail table for physical support. "I did not lose my memory." Elijah continued, his sharp gaze sweeping across the terrified faces of Yvonne, Chloe, and DeAndre. "I simply wanted to see exactly what my greedy son, my superficial daughter-in-law, and my incredibly entitled granddaughter would do if they genuinely thought I was helpless. I wanted to see the true nature of the vipers circling my bed. And you all performed exactly as I expected. You did not disappoint me with your profound, sickening cruelty." Elijah gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward to deliver a public execution of his own bloodline. The journalists in the front row were practically vibrating with adrenaline, their digital recorders thrust high into the air, capturing every single damning syllable. "You thought I was deaf and blind while you plotted in my own hallways," Elijah thundered, his voice dripping with venom. "You, Calvin, my own son. I built an empire with my bare hands. I laid bricks, I negotiated contracts. I sacrificed my youth to ensure this family would never experience poverty. And what did you do with my legacy? You used it to buy cheap scotch and cheaper political favors. You secretly placed a massive tax lien on this very estate because you gambled away your own trust fund on foolish, arrogant ventures. You thought you could just wait for me to die and inherit the kingdom you never worked a single hour to build. Calvin squeezed his eyes shut, fat tears of absolute humiliation rolling down his purple-flushed cheeks. He could not look his father in the eye. He could not even look at the floor. He was a completely broken, pathetic man. And instead of learning from your endless failures, Elijah continued, shifting his furious gaze to Yvonne and Chloe, you enabled this rot. You threw away the only brilliant daughter this family produced. He gestured sharply toward me. You cast Zuri out into the cold because her intelligence and her relentless work ethic threatened your fragile, pathetic egos. She actually inherited my business acumen. She understood the value of $1 and the heavy weight of hard work. But you threw her away just to coddle the fools who wanted to strip my bones entirely bare for imported designer clothes and fraudulent political ads. He pointed directly at DeAndre, who immediately flinched, holding his hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender. You let this smooth-talking fraud into my home, Elijah roared. You let him disrespect my legacy, forge my name, and use my hard-earned reputation to buy a Senate seat he does not deserve. You watched him smile for the cameras while he secretly planned to throw me into a substandard, state-run facility the absolute second the ink dried on his stolen checks. You are all a disgrace to the name I built. The sheer crushing weight of Grandpa Elijah's public condemnation finally broke Chloe completely. Her knees buckled violently, and she collapsed directly onto the hard wooden floor of the stage. Her scarlet silk dress pooled around her as she fell to her knees, openly sobbing, her chest heaving with frantic, desperate gasps for air. Her perfect, meticulously styled hair was now a tangled, sweaty mess clinging to her wet cheeks. "Grandpa, please!" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical wail. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, reaching desperately toward his dark trousers. "Please, you have to understand, I had to do it. I had the power of attorney." She frantically pointed down at the forged documents she had dropped on the ballroom floor. "It is my legal right. I am your granddaughter. You cannot let Zuri do this to us. We are your real family." Grandpa Elijah slowly looked down at the sobbing, pathetic woman groveling at his feet. His sharp eyes contained absolutely zero warmth, zero pity, and zero forgiveness. He looked at her with pure, absolute, unadulterated disgust. "You forged a completely useless piece of paper," Chloe Elijah stated, his deep voice carrying a terrifying finality across the utterly silent grand ballroom. His heavy, undeniable words struck her like massive physical blows, crushing her completely forever. "Because 5 years ago, long before you ever started plotting my demise, I transferred every single dime, every commercial property, and this very estate into an irrevocable blind trust. I haven't owned this estate on paper for 5 years." Grandpa Elijah declared, his deep voice slicing effortlessly through Chloe's hysterical, choking sobs. He leaned heavily against the clear acrylic podium, his dark eyes burning with a righteous, furious intensity that demanded absolute submission from the room. The sole trustee and executor of that irrevocable blind trust, the only person standing on this earth with the absolute legal authority to manage, sell, or leverage a single blade of grass on this entire historic property, is Zuri. The devastating realization hit the villains like a runaway freight train. Chloe stopped crying instantly. Her breath hitched sharply in her throat, her chest freezing mid-heave. She stared up at her grandfather, her mascara-streaked face twisting into a grotesque mask of pure, uncomprehending denial. DeAndre physically collapsed against the thick velvet stage curtains behind him. His knees gave out entirely, causing him to slide down the luxurious fabric until he hit the floor with a pathetic thud. He gripped his perfectly styled hair with both trembling hands, his mouth opening and closing rapidly like a suffocating fish. Calvin stumbled backward on the main floor, clutching his chest with a white-knuckled grip. He looked exactly as though he were experiencing a massive cardiovascular event. Yvonne covered her mouth with both hands, a shrill, terrified squeak escaping her trembling lips. The untouchable, arrogant fortress of their entitlement completely disintegrated into fine dust before their very eyes. They had spent months meticulously planning to steal an empire that had legally belonged to me the entire time. I stepped forward, my emerald silk gown gliding smoothly over the wooden planks of the stage. The heavy fabric made a soft sweeping sound that somehow echoed perfectly in the deafening electric silence of the grand ballroom. I walked directly past Chloe, not offering her a single glance of pity or acknowledgement. I moved to Grandpa Elijah's side. He looked at me, a profound, weary pride softening the harsh lines of his weathered face. He handed the microphone back to me with a firm, steady grip. He had played his part flawlessly. Now it was time to execute the final fatal maneuver. I turned to face the paralyzed crowd of Atlanta elites. I reached out with my free hand. Marcus, my intimidating head of security, stepped up to the edge of the stage and handed me a thick black leather folder. The metallic snap of the clasp echoed sharply across the room. I opened the folder deliberately, letting the sheer anticipation agonizingly stretch across the massive space. I pulled out a stack of crisp watermarked bank documents. I looked directly down at DeAndre, who was huddled pathetically on the floor against the heavy stage curtains. DeAndre, I began, my voice amplified and dripping with absolute freezing ice. Since Grandpa Elijah did not own this house, that massive multi-million-dollar bridge loan you took out yesterday, using this historic estate as collateral, that is textbook undeniable bank fraud. DeAndre let out a pathetic, strangled whimper. He tried to scramble backward, but his shoulders hit the wall. There was absolutely nowhere left for him to hide. The wealthy political donors in the front row stared at him with unadulterated disgust. You walked into a federally insured financial institution. I continued my words, striking him like physical blows. And you actively pledged an asset you had absolutely no legal right to touch. But your breathtaking, arrogant stupidity did not stop there. You knew the bank required a secondary guarantor because your own credit is entirely fictional. So you forged a signature. I turned my gaze slowly, locking eyes with Calvin, who was trembling violently near the shattered remains of his dropped Scotch glass. I held up the final page of the loan agreement, ensuring the bright blue ink of the fraudulent signature was clearly visible even from a distance. You forged my father's signature as the primary guarantor on the loan, I stated, making sure every single syllable resonated through the high-fidelity speakers. Calvin, your golden son-in-law, just permanently bound you to a multi-million-dollar federal fraud investigation. Since you spent the last 6 months aggressively backing his campaign and publicly endorsing his business ventures, federal prosecutors will absolutely view you as a willing, active co-conspirator. He's taking you down with him, and you handed him the shovel. Calvin let out a raw, guttural roar of pure, unfiltered rage. He lunged forward, trying desperately to reach the stage to strangle DeAndre, but my security detail intercepted him. They crossed their massive arms, forming an impenetrable human shield. Calvin crashed heavily into them, screaming vile obscenities, entirely losing his mind in front of the most powerful people in the state. He realized his entire reputation, his accumulated wealth, and his freedom were gone forever. I completely ignored Calvin's pathetic, violent tantrum. I shifted my attention directly to the audience. I looked at the sea of pale, horrified faces, the senators, the real estate moguls, and the megachurch pastors who had blindly funded this circus were completely paralyzed. For those of you standing in the front rows, I projected my tone, shifting from familial executioner to corporate whistleblower. I highly suggest you check your email inboxes immediately. My team just sent a comprehensive encrypted data dump to every single major news outlet and political correspondent in this room. I paused, deliberately watching dozens of manicured hands simultaneously reach into tuxedo pockets and designer clutches. Smartphone screens illuminated the dark crowd, casting a pale, ghostly glow over their shocked, highly offended expressions. DeAndre did not use your generous political donations to fund campaign ads, I announced, watching the brutal realization shatter the room. He did not use your money to build community centers or launch grassroots initiatives. He used your hard-earned capital to pay off a $300,000 gambling debt at a private unlicensed casino in the Bahamas. The outrage that erupted from the crowd was instantaneous and deafening. The megachurch pastor threw his hands into the air, shouting about betrayal and sin. The real estate moguls began cursing loudly, demanding their money back and threatening immediate lawsuits. I raised my hand, demanding absolute silence, and the sheer heavy authority of my presence forced the room to quiet down. "You will not get your money back tonight," I stated bluntly. "Those offshore accounts were permanently frozen by my corporate legal team at exactly 5 o'clock this afternoon. The comprehensive financial records, including every single wire transfer, every forged invoice, and every fraudulent campaign expense report, are currently sitting in the inbox of the State Ethics Committee. I also forwarded the entire unredacted file to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation." DeAndre screamed. It was a high, terrified sound that violently ripped from his throat. He scrambled on his hands and knees across the wooden stage, aggressively grabbing the hem of my emerald gown. "Zuri, please," he begged, thick tears mixing with the heavy sweat pouring down his face. "You cannot do this. I will withdraw from the race. I will give it all back. I will sign whatever you want. Please, they will put me in federal prison." I looked down at the pathetic man who had tried to steal my grandfather's legacy. I felt absolutely no pity, no remorse, and no sympathy. "You should have thought about prison before you tried to rob an old man in his own home," I replied, my voice completely devoid of human warmth. I stepped back forcefully, pulling the luxurious silk of my dress out of his desperate, grasping hands. The grand ballroom was now a theater of absolute, unmitigated chaos. Chloe remained curled into a tight, trembling ball on the floor, weeping hysterically, her expensive jewelry scratching against the wooden stage planks. She was muttering unintelligible apologies to no one in particular, her fragile mind completely shattered by the sudden violent destruction of her entire universe. Calvin was still screaming at my security guards, his face a terrifying shade of crimson, while Yvonne sobbed loudly into her hands, realizing her high society status was permanently obliterated. The political donors were shouting demands, pulling out their phones to desperately summon their own legal counsel. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing sound cut directly through the heavy, shouting voices in the ballroom. Sirens wailed in the distance. The sound was faint at first, echoing through the cold night air, but it grew rapidly louder and significantly more aggressive with every passing second. The wailing pitch rose, multiplying as several heavy vehicles approached the property at high speed. The wealthy guests near the floor-to-ceiling windows gasped, pointing outward. Bright flashing red and blue lights violently pierced the darkness, reflecting sharply off the historic glass panes and throwing chaotic spinning colors across the ballroom walls. The heavy crunch of gravel echoed loudly. The front doors swing wide open. Armed federal agents step into the foyer. I check my watch. Right on time. 6 federal agents in dark tactical jackets, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI, marched purposefully into the glittering space. They moved in a tight, highly disciplined formation straight down the center aisle, directly toward the brightly illuminated stage. The sea of wealthy donors, who had just been aggressively whispering about offshore accounts and frozen funds, practically trampled each other, trying to scramble out of the way. The agents' boots thudded heavily against the polished hardwood floor, a steady, terrifying drumbeat of impending justice. I remained standing near the DJ booth, folding my arms across the emerald silk of my bodice, watching the absolute destruction of DeAndre's fraudulent political empire unfold with perfect surgical precision. DeAndre was still on his hands and knees, staring at the approaching agents with a slack jaw and wide, uncomprehending eyes. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a completely impassive expression, stepped effortlessly up onto the wooden platform. He did not hesitate. He reached down, grabbed DeAndre by the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo, and hauled him forcefully to his feet. DeAndre let out a pathetic, high-pitched squeak, his arms flailing uselessly at his sides. The agent spun him around with practiced force, slamming him face first into the clear acrylic podium. The sound of DeAndre's nose hitting the thick plastic echoed sharply through the room. DeAndre Miller, the lead agent, announced, his deep voice carrying easily without the need for a microphone. "You are under arrest for federal bank fraud, wire fraud, and multiple severe violations of campaign finance law. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The distinct metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around DeAndre's wrists sliced through the dead silence of the ballroom. The absolute finality of that sound sent a violent visible shudder through the crowd of elite politicians and high net worth campaign sponsors. They watched in pure, unadulterated horror as the golden boy of Atlanta politics was thoroughly and aggressively neutralized in front of their very eyes. He had spent long years desperately courting these powerful people, shaking their hands, drinking their expensive scotch, and promising them endless legislative favors. Now they looked at him as if he were a rotting corpse. They instinctively pulled their expensive coats tighter around their shoulders, stepping backward, terrified that his radioactive criminal stench might somehow ruin their own pristine reputations. The sight of the steel cuffs locking around her husband's wrists finally broke through the paralyzing shock, holding Chloe hostage. A raw, piercing scream tore violently from her throat, a sound so utterly unhinged it sounded entirely inhuman. She scrambled up from the wooden floorboards, the heavy scarlet silk of her designer dress tearing loudly as her stiletto heel caught the delicate fabric. She lunged frantically toward the lead federal agent, her hands outstretched, completely blinded by panic and toxic arrogance. "You cannot do this!" she shrieked, her face twisted into a mask of pure feral desperation. "Do you have any idea who we are? He is a state senator. You are making a massive mistake. Let him go right now." She aggressively grabbed the agent's tactical jacket, her long acrylic nails digging into the heavy nylon material. The agent did not even flinch. He simply shifted his weight and delivered a swift, powerful shove to Chloe's shoulder. The forceful physical rejection sent her flying backward. She crashed hard onto the polished wooden stage, her wrists sliding painfully across the rough planks. She gasped for air, looking wildly around the room for any source of salvation. She locked eyes with our parents, standing, paralyzed near the open bar. "Mom." "Dad," Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with sheer terror as two more agents stepped forward to flank the handcuffed DeAndre. "Do something, call a lawyer, call the governor, stop them." But Calvin and Yvonne did absolutely nothing. They remained entirely frozen in place, trapped in a state of supreme, suffocating humiliation. Calvin's face had drained from a furious purple to a sickly, translucent gray. His hands hung limply at his sides, completely stripped of the aggressive, domineering posture he had wielded like a weapon his entire life. Yvonne looked like a fragile porcelain doll that had just been shattered with a hammer. She was trembling violently, her eyes darting nervously toward the front row of the audience. Standing mere feet away from them was the powerful mega-church pastor, the man whose endorsement they had desperately relied upon to secure their social standing. The mega-church pastor was staring directly at Calvin and Yvonne, his face contorted with absolute unfiltered disgust. Beside him stood the wealthy couples from their exclusive country club, the elite socialites. Yvonne had spent decades relentlessly catering to and impressing. They were whispering behind their hands, pointing directly at my parents with expressions of profound revulsion. In that single, agonizing moment, Calvin and Yvonne realized the catastrophic truth. The millions of dollars in stolen assets, the meticulously curated public image, the arrogant demands for respect, it was all entirely eradicated. They were no longer the powerful patriarch and the elegant matriarch of a thriving dynasty. They were the pathetic, enabling parents of a disgraced criminal and a hysterical fraud. Their highly coveted social standing was now permanently dead. The lead agent signaled his team, and they began forcefully dragging DeAndre toward the grand double doors. DeAndre dragged his feet, his expensive leather shoes scuffing the hardwood, openly weeping as he was hauled past the donors he had systematically robbed. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind him, leaving a suffocating void in the ballroom. The flashing red and blue lights outside continued to bathe the historic windows in a harsh, unforgiving glare. Chloe remained on the floor of the stage, her chest heaving with violent, ragged sobs. Her scarlet dress was ruined, her makeup was smeared across her cheeks in dark, heavy streaks, and her rented diamonds looked completely absurd against the backdrop of her total destruction. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I did not need to scream to assert my absolute dominance. I moved slowly and deliberately across the wooden platform, my emerald gown whispering softly, until I stood directly over her trembling, pathetic form. I reached into the sleek velvet clutch resting against my hip. I bypassed the encrypted USB drive and my smartphone, my fingers closing around a thick, folded legal document printed on heavy watermarked paper. I pulled the document out and held it down toward her. Chloe slowly looked up, her bloodshot eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. I simply dropped the heavy document. It landed squarely on her lap with a soft thud. Since you do not own this house, and since Deandre's remaining assets were just completely frozen by the federal government under the RICO Act, I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the perfectly silent ballroom. I have officially terminated your residency. Here is your 30-day eviction notice. I looked down at the sister who had made my childhood a living hell, the woman who had happily forged documents to steal our grandfather's legacy, just to buy herself a few fleeting moments of fake political power. I felt absolutely nothing but cold clinical detachment. Pack your trash, Chloe, I commanded, turning my back on her before she could even formulate a single syllable of protest. I descended the wooden stage steps, the crowd of wealthy guests still parted completely, offering me a wide, unobstructed path toward the exit. I had accomplished exactly what I came to do. The fraudulent empire was dismantled. The truth was violently exposed. The house was legally secured. I walked with my head held high, my security detail falling seamlessly into step behind me. I reached the center of the dance floor when a sudden frantic movement caught my eye. Yvonne broke away from Calvin. Her pristine, elegant facade was entirely gone. She looked wild, desperate, and completely broken. She ran toward me, her expensive high heels clicking erratically against the floor. She threw herself forward with reckless abandon. Before my security team could intercept her, she dropped violently to her knees right in front of me. She reached out with both trembling hands, her fingers desperately grabbing the heavy emerald silk hem of my custom gown. She gripped the fabric so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. Her perfectly styled hair was falling around her tear-streaked face, her eyes wide with a frantic, unhinged panic. The realization of her total financial and social ruin had finally crashed down upon her, crushing her completely. "Zuri, please!" Yvonne wailed, her voice echoing shrilly across the silent, stunned crowd of elites. The dignified matriarch was gone, replaced by a beggar groveling on the floor of a crime scene. "We are your parents. We are blood. You cannot leave us with nothing. Have some human mercy." I looked down at the weeping, shattered woman, desperately clutching my hem. There was absolutely no sympathy in my eyes, only a profound, echoing emptiness. The frantic mother crying on the floor was a total stranger to me. I took a slow, deliberate step backward. The heavy emerald silk slid easily from her white-knuckled grip. Yvonne slumped forward, her hands hitting the hardwood floor as she realized I was never going to save her. "Mercy," I repeated softly, the single word hanging like a frozen icicle in the silent ballroom. My voice was clinical, completely detached from her wild hysteria. "You did not have mercy when you explicitly called me ugly. You did not show an ounce of mercy when you aggressively branded me a massive failure and a constant disappointment to your pristine social image." I looked from Yvonne to Calvin, who was still staring at me with completely hollow, defeated eyes. "You boldly told me that failures do not belong in this family. You were absolutely right. I am taking out the garbage. So get out. Get out of my house immediately before I have my security team physically drag you out the front doors." 3 months later, the thick dust from that explosive night had finally settled, leaving a radically altered reality in its wake. The swift, brutal hand of federal justice moved with terrifying efficiency. Deandre was currently serving severe federal prison time. He sat in a stark concrete cell, having accepted a rapid plea deal to avoid a lengthy, highly publicized trial that would have exposed even more crimes. He traded his custom-tailored silk suits for a scratchy standard-issue orange jumpsuit. His political career was entirely dead, his name completely erased from every public building and donor list in the state. Chloe experienced a spectacular downfall that was equally devastating. Stripped of her fraudulent assets and completely abandoned by her high society friends, she was now living in a cramped, poorly ventilated studio apartment on the wrong side of the city. Her golden days of designer clothes, expensive champagne, and exclusive spa treatments were permanently over. She was working a grueling minimum wage retail job, forced to fold cheap sweaters for incredibly rude customers just to afford her weekly groceries and the bus fare back to her tiny depressing room. Furthermore, my relentless corporate attorneys had officially slapped her with a massive civil lawsuit for document forgery and attempted fraud. Her meager wages were heavily garnished. She was slowly drowning in insurmountable legal debt, with absolutely no way out of the crushing poverty she had always openly mocked. Calvin and Yvonne suffered a social execution that was both absolute and entirely merciless. The elite mega-church pastor publicly denounced them from the pulpit, officially excommunicating them from the affluent congregation they had spent decades trying to dominate and manipulate. The exclusive country club revoked their membership immediately, citing a strict moral turpitude clause. They were radioactive. No one would take their desperate calls or answer their emails, stripped of their stolen funds, and crippled by the astronomical legal fees generated by DeAndre's catastrophic federal fallout. They were forced into humiliating social exile. They currently lived in a cheap, outdated suburban rental property, spending their miserable days arguing bitterly with each other about who was exactly to blame for their total inescapable destruction and their sudden horrifying descent into complete obscurity. The grand estate in Buckhead, however, had undergone a glorious, breathtaking resurrection. I stood on the sprawling, perfectly manicured front lawn, feeling the warm Georgia sun against my face. The massive historic mansion was no longer a hollow monument to superficial elite status. It was no longer a dark fortress of toxic vanity and greedy entitlement. I had completely transformed the magnificent property into the official headquarters for Vanguard Heritage Holdings' new philanthropic nonprofit division. It was now a thriving state-of-the-art educational incubator program. We dedicated our massive resources to teaching commercial real estate, architectural design, and advanced financial literacy to young, incredibly ambitious Black students who had been systematically overlooked by the traditional corporate establishment. The grand ballroom, where my deceptive family had once proudly plotted my total destruction, was now filled with modern drafting tables, high-powered computer stations, and brilliant young minds mapping out their own successful independent futures. Grandpa Elijah stood right beside me, leaning comfortably on his aluminum cane. He was genuinely smiling. It was not the tight, calculated smirk he used in cutthroat boardrooms, but a warm, authentic expression of pure, unadulterated pride. He reached out and placed his large, heavily weathered hand firmly on my shoulder. His strong grip was a deeply grounding weight, a silent, powerful transfer of generational power and enduring respect. "We did it, Zuri," he said quietly, looking up at the towering brick facade of the mansion. "You saved it." "I did not just save the building," I replied, watching a group of eager, smiling students walk up the front steps, their heavy backpacks full of fresh blueprints and complex financial models. "We gave it an actual purpose." I looked at the magnificent estate and the bright, undeniable future we were actively building within its historic, highly protected walls. I had spent my entire life being treated like a completely disposable burden. They had relentlessly labeled me the family scapegoat, brutally throwing me directly into the fire to quickly cover their own spectacular, arrogant failures. But they had completely underestimated my absolute, unyielding strength. The scapegoat did not just passively survive their treacherous fire. I stepped directly into it. I fearlessly controlled the aggressive flames, burned their incredibly fraudulent empire straight down to the ground, and forged a true, fiercely unbreakable legacy directly from the smoldering ashes. This was not just about revenge. It was about absolute, undeniable justice. I had finally taken back everything they tried to steal from me. I was completely free, and my true life was just beginning right here on this very lawn.